Hello everybody, my name is Brian Nunez and I'm a Losi brand manager. And with me today is Frank Root. He's our category manager for all the performance products here under Losi. I have a really good treat for you because Frank is one of the 3 critical people that is responsible for not only the development but also the design of the Promoto-Mx. I hope that we can kind of take a deep dive into this, and because obviously it looks amazing. And we can get there, but looks is only one aspect of it. I like to start with the technology. You know, it seems like we worked really closely with the Spectrum team to develop what we're calling MS6X Technology. Give me a quick rundown at what that technology is.
Yeah, so basically the MS6X is motorcycle stabilization 6-axis. And it comes from the Spectrum side of SAFE and AS3X. And we basically evolved that technology into what would work for 2 wheels to help a motorcycle maintain balance and be able to perform. And the technology can sense the angle that the bike is at and give outputs to the servo to help the bike push itself to that angle, despite the speed that it's at, whether it's a high speed or a low speed. And that's what makes it work really consistently at all speeds.
Gotcha. Now that technology, is that all just in the receiver, or is there a separate unit, or is it, how clean is that technology?
The 6-axis technology is based in the receiver. It's sensing where gravity is, and then based off of the pull of gravity, it can sense forces that change direction, how many degrees it is away from gravity. So it always knows not only the side-to-side lean of the bike, but it also knows the pitch and accelerations and yaw. So it always has an idea of where the bike is and what kind of outputs it can give the servo to help it get to the input that you're inputting with the steering wheel and keep it in the right attitude.
So that's a good point, because it's not just about lean, right? It's also the pitch and the yaw if we're using airplane technology. And I think now that we have that technology, that's for stabilization, but we can also use that technology for other features like drive modes. Because the radio comes with 3 drive modes. Let's talk about that and how does that work?
Yeah, so the thing we learned right away is the way that you need the bike to work on dirt or asphalt or grass is quite a bit different. This has a really high CG compared to like most RC cars, right? So the acceleration, the wheelies happen really easily. So on dirt, you don't want to suppress the wheelie too early because you need to be able to go up jump faces without cutting the throttle. On asphalt though, if it's wheeling at all, you're not really accelerating super fast. So we want to suppress the wheelie and allow the bike to accelerate as fast as possible. And then the last mode we have, so that would be mode 3, is really, we call it wheelie control, and that's a fun mode for me. You basically just grab full throttle and the bike will just pop up in a wheelie, and the receiver outputs the throttle so that it balances and maintains that wheelie over up to a couple hundred feet. Continue wheeling on. So you have drive mode 1 for dirt, wheelie prevention, drive mode 2 for asphalt, wheelie suppression at more lean angles so you can make tighter turns at higher speeds, and then drive mode 3 is that wheelie control for just a lot of fun.
Perfect. And we're calling those on the fly, because you can literally switch with your radio, with your thumb on the fly, even while you're on the track, on the street. How does that work?
Yeah, so you have your switches here, your A/B rocker on the transmitter, and you start off in drive mode 1, which is the drive mode for dirt. And if you click on the A button, you will go up to drive mode 2. You'll get a double flash here on the transmitter and a double beep, and you'll know you're in drive mode 2. And then that's the wheelie suppression mode, where it's going to keep the front tire down so that you can accelerate more quickly. And then if you click up to A again, it'll go up 3 flashes, 3 beeps, and that's the wheelie control. And then if you click B, you'll go back down from 3 to 1. So you can basically pick what mode you want to go in. So you could literally be, ripping some roost on the dirt and drive over to the edge of the track, change to drive mode 3 and pop a wheelie on the asphalt right afterwards, and back and forth. And you can do it as you're driving. You don't even need to stop the bike.
Awesome. Cool. Now let's also talk about that MS6X rate knob, which most people probably know as the AVC knob. This is technically, if you tell by the wheel, it's a specific radio for the Promoto. What does that knob do?
It's a great point. We did make a specific new DX3 PM Promoto for the motorcycle, and we molded a gray wheel for it so that it's really easily identifiable, right? You're not gonna accidentally grab your radio for a different Losi vehicle. But we have the MS6X knob here, and basically that turns the technology portion of the receiver up or down depending on your skills as a driver or the surface that you're running on. So as you turn the knob up clockwise, you're gonna get more MS6X intervention in terms of it's gonna give you more control to be able to lean the bike further. And conversely, as you turn the knob counterclockwise and you go down, you get a little less lean angle. You get a little less lean angle, so it's a little easier to drive as you're learning. And then the wheelie control angle will be down a little bit lower, and it's just a little more stable in terms of being able to just stay at that wheelie and ride it out for a long time.
Perfect. Now those things work hand in hand because steering isn't just as easy as turning and the bike steers, but when you get to a good level, a pro level, you can do so much more and turn so much sharper. And I think the lean bars have a lot to do with that. We've seen other products where the lean bar is so much simpler. How does the lean bar affect steering?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, really, like you said, a lot of the motorcycles before just had big metal bars that would basically just wrap around the edge of the chassis. Well, what happens is when you lean over and you start bouncing off that bar, you start bouncing yourself out of the lean, and that bounces you out of the steering. The other thing is to actually lean to the right, you're actually gonna have your forks going to the left. And so when you start sitting on that lean bar and dragging it, now you have a dragging point here, and you have that tire actually going that way, and it opens up your arc quite a bit, right? So the reason why we have these lean bars and the way that we design them is that they're spring loaded so that they can roll more or less depending on what kind of surface you're running on and your skill level. Obviously, the further that you lean over before they contact, the more aggressive the steering can be, but the easier the tires can slide out too as you kind of load them. So the good news is they're adjustable, not only how low they start, but how high they stop. You can get all the parts with the motorcycle to be able to adjust those. And you can adjust them obviously for different surfaces. On dirt, the thing that's really cool is when you get to low speed, for anybody that rides like a mountain bike or a motorcycle, you kind of know like you could slide your rear tire a lot and be fine. As soon as that front tire slides, you take a dirt sample, right? That's what we call it when you taste the dirt. So with the RC motorcycle, you're gonna slide the front tire sometimes, it happens. Well, here we have the lean bar to basically, as soon as the front tire slides, okay, now you're on the lean bar, you basically caught the bike, you're able to maintain momentum, and you still have weight on the rear tire, you're still able to drive out of it, pick the bike back up, and continue on your turn.
Perfect. Now I do know, even when we were testing and having some fun, the secret sauce, which we'll get into that in another video if you check out our YouTube channel, is the bike turns its best technically right before the lean bar is on the dirt. Just wanted to mention that, you know, the lean bars not only are there just to help you, like you said, corner through an actual corner and go through a corner, but you can't just ride them all the time. They're not there to let you corner. It's a finesse that you have to learn. So that's good. Now that we talked about cornering, let's talk about the steering, because there's two things. I think our industry has servo savers as a standard, right? But this not only has a servo saver, but it also has head dampening. How do those two things work together, and why did we come up with that?
Yeah, so in the development of the motorcycle project, right, we realized very early on that we needed a servo saver, and not to protect the servo. Like the servo's durability is kind of without question. There's not as much load going through it as you would think, even with the diameter of the tire. But as soon as you put the bike onto a dirt surface and you get over to those lean angles, you hit a bump, a rut, a rock, or something that would maybe pick up or try and knock the front tire off of its axis, and you really lost a lot of control. So the servo saver is really there to accept changes in terrain without upsetting the bike. It helps keep the attitude of the bike more consistent, and it helps keep the electronic loop of feedback between your input, your output, the servo, and everything more harmonious, makes it way easier to drive. The head dampening is basically something that we came up with to help control the servo saver, which is basically a spring, right? So like any rear shock, right? If you only have a spring, it's going to be bouncing all over the place. You need the dampening to help control the force of the spring, and that's what the head dampening is. So on the head tube here, between the upper and lower bearing, it's actually filled with 500,000 weight CST oil. It's thin enough that the servo saver can move it without issue, but thick enough to keep it from kind of being out of control as it moves through its motions.
Gotcha. For those real MX guys, it's the same thing, right? They have head dampening for the triple clamps. So same type of technology, just in RC form. So I think the last key thing for technology, because we talked about MX success, right? We talked about how it steers, including with the lean bars. There's one key piece, and what I like to think about it, it's this motorcycle has a hybrid of, you know, electronic technology and mechanical technology, things that electronics can do, and these things work in harmony. And that main, you know, mechanical piece is the gyro inside. This massive, over a pound of a flywheel really that spins at over 20,000 RPMs, where if you try to hold it by yourself, you can barely turn it yourself, causing stabilization. Let's talk about kind of the gyro and how that not only affects the stabilization, but also the handling as you're jumping, as you're going through whoops.
Yeah, so basically in the center of the bike here, right behind the lean bars, there's actually a 500 plus gram steel flywheel. And like Brian said, it spins at actually over 22,000 RPM. It's really hauling the mail in there. It's creating a ton of inertia. So like if you have the bike on and the flywheel spinning, if you just hold the bike like this and you try and twist it sideways, you actually get a force pushing back on that. If you try and lean it over quickly, you get a force pushing back on that because you're creating inertia on the axis. And basically when you introduce outside forces, it helps kind of push against that to stabilize. One of the real big keys to that is that on a lot of RC motorcycles, that flywheel would be in the rear wheel. So it requires a lot of mass and momentum in the rear wheel, and it makes the bike drive in a way where it looks like all the weight's just shifting around the rear wheel, but that's not how real motorcycles look or ride. They have a center of mass in the middle of the bike with the engine, and they kind of move around the engine. And because our flywheel is here, super low, all the way against the bottom and all the way up front in the chassis, it gives the motorcycle not only the balance, but the right look and feel without having a ton of unsprung weight or moving the center of mass all the way to the back of the bike.
Yeah, that's huge, especially with some of those other motorcycles. That flywheel and the back wheel is gear driven. And not only does it sound much louder, it's not as efficient, but it's also more parts that could potentially fail. Versus our system, it's essentially an outrunner with the flywheel attached to the outside of it with its own speed controller built to the back of the motor. So it's really this all clean, all-in-one unit that has no gears. Like pretty much failure or risk is minimal, which I think is huge.
Yeah, so basically it's a steel flywheel, and then there's a 2-in-1 ESC and stator unit that basically has the motor shaft, and it basically slides into the middle of the flywheel through some bearings. Basically it's an enclosed unit, so I could put a flywheel unit in your hand and you can feel the force that it's putting out, or the stabilization that it wants to push against. And it's really clean, really efficient, and just drops right in the bike.
That's awesome. Now before we finish off on the technology portion of the motorcycle, let's go through the radio. Because especially if you're not into RC or if you never owned a DX3 before, let's go through some of the features, starting with the top. I mean, the first thing I see is a throttle limiting switch, which I think is huge, especially if you're buying this, you know, as a dad, as an uncle, and you want to let Junior get a test drive. That throttle limiter switch, how does that work?
Yeah, so basically when you're first getting into RC, it's really good to maybe start at a slightly lower speed. You know, learning those things, you're gonna make a couple mistakes, and it's a lot better to make those mistakes at a slower speed. So we have a throttle limit switch here, and all you do is you just flip it to the left, and you get 50% of the speed of the power system. So you'll go roughly 20 miles an hour, and you go to 75, and you'll get 3/4, 75% of that speed. You go roughly 30 miles an hour, and you go to 100. You get the full shebang of power there, and you're gonna go 40 plus with the MX.
That's awesome. So there's that. We also have a flywheel switch. And if you purchase this bike and you went through a quick start guide or even saw our quick start guide video, you understand what that does. But kind of briefly, I think one thing we can mention is what that does, and also the drag brake component to the flywheel.
Yeah, so the flywheel doesn't automatically turn on. Obviously there's situations where you want the bike on to check your steering or whatever, and you don't necessarily need the flywheel to kick on immediately when you plug in a battery or power on the bike. So with the flywheel switch, it's off, and obviously you just turn it on to the on position. The flywheel starts to accelerate. because it is such a heavy piece of steel and a large piece of mass, it does take 30 to 35 seconds for it to spin up to full RPM, that 22,000 RPM we were talking about. Well, it's also free spinning at that speed. It takes quite a while for it to slow down. So if you were to just shut your bike off with the flywheel switch still on, it's gonna take 4 to 5 minutes for that flywheel to stop spinning. Well, the flywheel has an intuitive drag brake built into it. So if the bike is still powered on and you turn the flywheel switch off, the drag brake will apply dynamically, and it takes about 30 to 35 seconds to stop the flywheel from full speed so that you can get powered off really quickly.
Awesome. Now I see 4 lights and battery level there. Now this is a full smart product. So that means if you're using a smart battery, you fire everything up. Those 4 lights not only give you an indication of your power level, but also a critical thing of when your battery's out of power, right?
Yeah, so you plug in a new battery, like we're recommending the G2 5000 milliamp IC5 Spectrum battery. And when you plug that in and it's fully charged, all 4 lights will light up. And basically when the first light goes out, you kind of know you got about 3/4 power left. When you get down to 2, half. When you get down to 1, you got about 25% of your battery life left. The nice thing is on the low battery, when you get down closer to that 10%, the first light will start flashing. And that's basically like, hey, I'm gonna run out of juice pretty soon. If you don't wanna walk over to get me, maybe start driving this way right now.
Right, don't take another lap,
Yep.
Bring it back in. Awesome. Now, is there any situation where that steering reverse switch is gonna need to be used, or is that just for later applications, other servos, things like that?
All of the servos that come in the motorcycle will be set to the normal position. They don't need reversed. So if somebody wants to upgrade their servo later, potentially depending on the manufacturer and the way that it's set, you might need it in the reverse position. If you do need it in the reverse position, you will need to rebind your transmitter with the switch in the reverse position, because the position of the servo also affects the way that the electronics are calibrated for correcting for the lean angle situation, right? So you need to make sure you bind it in the same position that you're going to use it in.
Perfect. But other than that, if you're running it in stock configuration, don't really need to touch it.
Nope.
Awesome. Now let's work our way into the knob. So we talked about the MS6 rate knob and what that does. What's the knob to the right of it?
Yeah, so the knob to the right of that is the front brake travel knob. So the front brake on the bike is controlled by a servo. So there's a servo underneath this right panel here, and it basically drives a cable running through this tube down to the caliper in the front. And the travel knob does exactly what it says. The more you turn it up, the more it's gonna move the brake up, the more brake pressure you're gonna get. Like I mentioned before, with motorcycles and bikes, you really don't wanna slide that front tire if you can avoid it. So if you get on like looser surfaces, like loose dirt, sand, you might wanna turn that knob down a little bit to keep that front tire from sliding.
Perfect. How about the next knob to the right of that?
Next knob is the steering sub trim. That one's pretty straightforward. If the bike's not going straight, give it a little bit of an adjustment. It's a good idea to let the bike lay on its side, give it 3 to 5 seconds, and then drive it again. Because of the force of gravity thing, it needs to kind of recalibrate what that steering trim is with no inertia going through the gyro system and the receiver. So it needs like a second to reset, and then it will drive with that effect out.
Gotcha. So if you kind of bike's veering slightly to the left, turn that to the right, test it, let it sit on its side for a little bit before you make any other adjustments.
Yeah, and because the system, the way the system controls the attitude of the bike, once the trim is good, it's good. So normally you should be able to get it out of the box and not have any issues. If you have to swap out the servo or maybe have like a really hard crash, you might need a little adjustment,
Gotcha.
But then you should be good from there.
So how about that last knob?
So that last knob, it's just the front brake trim. So it adjusts the trim of the brake servo specifically. And really that's adjusted during setup.
Okay.
So your bike has already been adjusted for that when you get it out of the box. We'll do a full video later on how to set up your brakes appropriately and show you how to dial that in if you need to rebuild them or swap out a cable or anything.
Awesome. Great. We talked about the A/B rocker and the drive modes and all that. And I think what we're trying to get at is that this radio is definitely more than just a basic radio that you get on most RTRs. It not only sets you up to have features, but more so options, I think is a good word for how you ride the motorcycle, your own driving style. Because different racers have different mentalities and different techniques, but also sets you up for the future on potential other Spectrum servo upgrades or stuff like that. So definitely a radio you're going to want to keep in hand. All right, so next I want to talk about what personally gets me excited as the marketing guy, right? And that's the way this thing looks. because it is super scale realistic. I mean, we did so many details to the, the actual levers, the little reservoirs for your clutch fluid, for your brake fluid, so many things in this thing. Now, let's go into the first thing, because I personally think, when something looks right, it looks right. You don't recognize it until it looks wrong, if that makes sense. And one of the things when you look at this bike and any other motorcycle is how narrow this is. The bike is legitimately scale, and part of the reason why it looks so good is because how narrow you guys were able to design that. Talk to me about kind of how that all worked out.
Yeah, so basically we've reviewed a lot of other RC motorcycles that are out there, and the biggest discrepancy between like real scale and where the RC motorcycles have been in the past is the chassis were really wide, like significantly wider and out of scale, and it just made everything look off. So what we did is we basically figured out that we needed only a 540 sized motor to provide enough power for the motorcycle. We got the width of the motor, the width of a standard 2S battery, and then we scaled the bike to be the width of those components and package everything within that width. So it was a real challenge. I mean, we have 2 speedos, 2 motors, the flywheel, 2 servos, obviously the drive motors, the battery, and it's all got to be packaged there between the 2 aluminum chassis plates. But that's how wide it is basically that 540 motor width and the 2S LiPo width, and everything else is kind of tucked inside of that chassis, and it fits, keeps the design really narrow. If you look at it from the front or the back, you can see how narrow it is. If you look at it from the top view down, you really see how narrow it is. The rider really looks proportionate on top of the bike.
That's awesome. Now, speaking of the rider, again, talk about a whole nother level. What I think what most people were expecting or are expecting is just foam with kind of some paint brushed on, but we have a legitimate kind of rubberized rider with all the details in the helmet, the boots, the gloves, but the obvious kind of elephant in the room, legit rider gear, jersey, pants. Insane. Talk to me about kind of why we decided to go that route. How did we end up here?
Yeah, so same thing. I mean, we're kind of looking at what else is out there, and most of the riders that have been around in the past, they're either like a polycarbonate type of clamshell thing that isn't super durable, kind of expensive to make, and kind of heavy because you have to screw it all together, or you have like a foam with a little bit of a rubberized edge on it, or just a straight rubber rider. The problem with the rubber rider, which is the most durable option, is that normally, like you said, they're painted or printed on, and then sometimes they'll put on stickers for graphics, so you go between matte and gloss, and it's just, nothing looks right. It all looks like an attempt to do something, but like a real motorcycle rider doesn't have anything painted on him, right? He's wearing a jersey. He's got his brands on there, his partners on there, and he's rocking that. And the best way to make something that was true to real scale was to go down the route of developing jerseys that fit on the rider, the boots, the helmet, getting those decorated just to look very authentic. We spent a lot of time combing through pictures of supercross and motocross races, trying to get the right stance of the rider. I mean, we want him to look like he's getting after it, but not like he's gonna go over the bars, and he's just ready to go out there and race. For me, the real important part, and it wasn't easy, is to just make sure that the rider's the right size for the bike. Because if he's 10% too big or 10% too small, it just blows the whole thing up. And I think with the narrow bike, it just looks awesome. And from even earlier in the project, when we didn't have all the decorations done, and driving the bike, seeing what it looks like on the track, to having the fully decorated one, it's just takes the experience up, several points of awesome.
For sure. And you mentioned one thing, it's like, again, when you're on the track, thinking about this just from a usability standpoint, when you have a car, I mean, we've been using Lexan bodies, polycarbon bodies for how long, and you flip, you slide, that's all been handy and good. But on this thing, talk to me about like the durability, because I think it seems like a very simple idea, but you can't get something too soft that kind of just folds everywhere, because then the rider's just bouncing everywhere. Can't get it too stiff because then he doesn't bend enough. So talk to me about kind of that process in developing an actual rider that's durable but looks good.
Yeah, I mean, it was really quite the process. I mean, we knew that this kind of rubberized material was the right material to get the durability correct, but making sure that it flexes enough to not break or fail or crack or crease And what we ended up doing, really great idea again by Gil, he's our all-star on this one, is we actually ended up going with a softer rubber, but inserting a foam inside of the chest. Like the firmness so that the head's not bouncing around more than is reasonable, but now it has the foam can collapse, the rubber can collapse, and it actually doesn't bend at the neck, it actually will bend through the shoulders if you get into a bigger wreck. I mean, the rider is very exposed on the top of the bike. If you, like I've done it a few times, you'd be in the air and like, oh crap, I'm not gonna land on the wheels. You tap the brake and you land on the softest part, which is the rider. And it's amazing how much it can ride away from those types of accidents and how great the durability is after all the trial and error.
That's awesome. Cool, so we talked about the narrow chassis, we talked about the Raider. Now let's talk about the panels and the graphics, because it's one of those things where it kind of worked out where we can be truly legit to scale. These are not Lexan panels, right? And talk to me about the kind of graphics on the outside.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing for me was, you know, what are real dirt bikes like, right? They aren't painted with flames and checkers and whatever we normally would put on our RC car trim schemes. And really the plastics on a real motorcycle are to protect the frame and the chassis. And on the RC motorcycle, to make it look correct, they were going to take a lot of the impact. They had to look the part, right, which was really important to get them colored. And then the other thing is we needed a good material that we could apply the graphics to. So you get the look in terms of the shape, the flow, how it, you know, the front panels work around the radiator shrouds, the shape of the front fender, matching the diameter of the wheel. But then you wrap it up with the graphics and it looks the part with some really cool liveries that replicate what you would see on the weekend at the track.
And that's, I think, another cool thing and exciting thing. These bikes look great here, but everybody wants to personalize, right? And I think one of the cool things that we're doing is if you go on lowseat.com, you can actually download the die lines for these graphics, just the die lines. So if you're a graphic artist yourself, or your buddy's a good graphic artist, you already have a special kind of livery or trim scheme that you run on your MX bike, you can apply that to this bike, print it out, apply it to not only a red, blue, or green bike, but at announcement, we have every single color you need, right?
Yeah, so we're coming out, obviously the 3 RTR bikes are red, blue, and green, and then we're also gonna have orange, yellow, white, and black panels, so you can kind of pretty much get to any color scheme or colorway that you want. One thing that is also really cool is all of the panels that you buy come with what we're calling the generic wrap kit, but it's basically a Losi inspired wrap kit that's black, gray, and white, so it'll match every color panel. And then those actually come with number sheets and blank number plates. So you put the number plates on, your number 247, awesome, pull off the 2, 4, and 7, put them on your number plate, and you're ready to represent yourself out there on the track.
Awesome, perfect. So we got all that. You can't overlook the tires on this thing. I see a Dunlop logo. They're officially licensed Geomax MX53s. Talk to me not just about the design, obviously helps realistic, but just tires are 90% of performance, right? How key was that?
Well, I mean, again, we keep going back to full scale motorsports, but I mean, that's where we're coming from. That's how we're race inspired. And the Geomax MX53 is one of the most popular tires for dirt bikes across the world. It clearly works on multiple surfaces, and we used our partnership with Dunlop to be able to license these tires to bring them in. I think one thing that was really evident to us right away is that normally we're on a kind of a softer rubber relative for RC vehicles, the weight's lower and everything. Well, we had to go up quite a bit on the shore rating of the rubber, so we're up to 60 shore rubber rate. And that really kept the firmness in the pins that allows the bike to have grip, be consistent, not flex around on the pins all the time. And it's just a really good balance. And the reason that I know the tires work really good, besides how they make the bike drive, is when I get done at the end of the day testing, I can see the tracks and the ruts that are getting formed in the track, right? Like we're pulling up the dirt, we see the roost flowing, and you really get a sense that tire's just gripping and ripping out there.
That's awesome. Now, if you start looking at the past, you notice that nobody else has ever done mesh wheels. And when we did kind of our spoked wheels, we realized that, that's because they're not as durable as they probably need to be. So as good as they look, they took a lot of development time and design time as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we started the design of the bike, the first thing we did was put up images of real bikes on the screen just to get like the silhouette, like where's the wheels going to be, where are the fenders, the size of the rider, etc. And as soon as you block out the wheel into a solid circle, it's just the whole image is broken. It doesn't work. So we knew we had to do a spoked wheel. We knew that we had to do a wheel that wasn't solid. We didn't want to, you know, kind of get away easy with like a mag type wheel or anything. So to create the spoked wheels and to mold them properly, they're two-piece wheels so that we can get the spokes done on each side, and then they assemble together and you mount the tire on. Made some like rapid prototype wheels. They broke right away. Okay, lesson learned. Let's open the mold and get some molded wheels. And even then we found out that the spokes that we had were just not thick enough to handle the load that we were seeing on the motorcycle, jumping big jumps. So we've had to beef up the spokes a little bit. We've added some extra screws to hold the two halves together. And really we have a really highly durable wheel now. I think it looks absolutely amazing. We're really glad that we went with the satin chrome finish on it. So it really pops off the bike. We're also gonna have wheels available as an option part in black. So you can kind of fit your own style there. And obviously if you're good with a rattle can, you can probably make them blue or whatever color you want to.
Awesome. So the last thing I think we need to talk about is not only this stand, but there's also a starting stand, right? And what's cool about this is not only does it look legit, but you have a little bit of, you know, marketing there, as you will, decal, you know, to kind of fit the brands, but it's also keyed, which I think is kind of crucial to kind of just lock the bike in and make things really easy for you. So am I missing anything on this stand?
Yeah, I mean, kind of the key was, and we figured this out pretty early in our testing, is right, you have a bike, obviously it doesn't have 4 tires, so it's not gonna balance on its own. So you either gotta leave it on its side the whole time when you work on it, or you gotta make a special kind of stand. Well, what we did is we made the bike stand, the first iteration was flat, and we kind of noticed that when you go to turn the bike, it would spin on the stand, and then if it slid over to the edge, it'd kind of tip over, and it made it not as easy to work on as we wanted to. So we basically keyed the stand to fit the bottom of the chassis so that now it holds the bike level, side to side. Now I can just move the stand, it moves the bike with me. So if I need to get a screw on this side, I turn it around, I can get to that screw. I need to go back on the other side and get to a different screw, I can turn it around and work on that screw. So that really helped for working on the bike. I think it looks great as like a display piece, obviously, sitting underneath a new bike with it all wrapped up and decorated.
Awesome. And the next stand, that is, you know, RC car can go down to the end of the track, set your car down, go walk up to the driver's stand. And what's cool about these bikes is you don't need like a crazy running start. It's not like an airplane needs somebody to toss you. It starts at really low speed, but one cool thing is that start stand, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's awesome, right, is something that's synonymous with motorcycle racing is, right, a gate start and everybody kind of launching at the same time. Well, now you got a starting stand, kind of tripods out there. It has some holes for some nails that are actually going to come with the bike. Just kind of nail it into the dirt there off to the start of the outside or start of the straightaway. And you basically just roll your rear tire back in there and walk up to the driver's stand, let your flywheel spin up, hit the throttle, and you'll just launch right out of it, and it'll stay where it's at, and you can do your next start. So whether you just want to set your bike down and walk up to a driver's stand or walk over a little bit, or just practice your whole shot starts, or if you and 4 of your buddies are going to line up and see who can get to the first turn or the whole shot line.
Yeah. Right, the whole shot's key. Awesome. So now that we talked about technology, we talked about the scale looks and the realism of it. Now, we're all gearheads. We all like tinkering, but we also don't like just wrenching and fixing things all the time, right? So durability is a key thing for this project. And it seems like when you guys did the design, obviously ground up, it seems like everything's a lot beefier than what it probably naturally is. Scale to a real bike, but I think that was on purpose, right?
Yeah, I mean, for us, the big thing is you don't want to, like you said, you don't want to break parts. You don't want to be fixing bikes. You want to be kind of hopping them up. And we just went through the whole bike. We 3D printed every part, rapid prototyped it when we were getting close to the end of the design. And any place where we were like, this part's like, it'll probably be all right, boom, plus 15% composite, or boom, plus 1 millimeter on the diameter of a pin. Whatever we thought to eliminate any durability issues, because we just want to be out there riding the whole time, not fixing.
Good point. I mean, this thing, it's big, but it's also, again, we talked about kind of that big mass of a flywheel. but the overall thing's what, probably 7-8 pounds of a bike?
8.2 without the battery. So just to put it in perspective, right? A nitro buggy weighs like 6.5 pounds. So we're like plus 1.5 pounds and a little bit over a nitro buggy. Right. So you definitely, just like durability is important to those vehicles, it's very important on the motorcycle as well.
You know, just looking at it, we have kind of these skid plates. We have these vents that, can be opened up. You see a lot of plastic here, but in reality, inside are 2 twin aluminum plates, right?
Yeah, so the base of the chassis, right, are 2 vertical twin aluminum 3mm thick plates, right? So stamped aluminum, machine finished, anodized. So those plates bolt up in several points that make them ultra durable. They house all the electronic components pretty much between them. So they keep all of that mass centralized, stable, protected, and they really make for a nice, stiff, sturdy frame that's not going to be flexing around too much. And then all of the rest of the bike, the head unit, the seat, the rear swing arm, all bolt between those basically.
Gotcha. Now, speaking of bolting between those, we have this front crash structure, which obviously it's sitting here, you don't really see, which is a good thing. You don't kind of want something obvious, but what does that front crash structure do?
So our number one concern when you start working on the product obviously is like, okay, braking parts. Well, you're gonna crash, you're gonna tumble, but what we really didn't wanna do was to have any issues bending or breaking forks, right? Like they're not cheap parts, they're not the thing that you wanna be swapping out. And if you take a hard hit on the front of a motorcycle, like that's something that can happen, right? You can bend the front of the forks. Well, what we did is we built in a head unit here, we call it the head unit, that controls the triple clamps, that actually has some articulation to it. It's got a really stiff rate spring and a short shock in the head unit, so that if you hit something head on, the forks can actually articulate back and absorb a lot of that energy without causing crash damage. So you can see here, as I kind of hold the fork, you can see that articulation there. And that's gonna save you, pretty much run the tire into that crash plate. That's gonna save you from bending forks.
Awesome. Seems like an absolute necessity, especially for the way that we were sending these things out there. So the other thing, again, something that I don't feel like we needed to do, but we took the extra mile, and there's kind of this groove here. What's that for?
Okay, so motorcycles wheelie?
Yep.
They wheelie a lot when you're not sitting on them to kind of control and feel the balance right away. And obviously the MS6X system is gonna catch a lot of those wheelies, but you're gonna get up on the rear tail and it's just gonna happen. There's no way around it. And when we had a solid one-piece fender on the back, we were consistently really bending that plastic fender pretty much right away, or bending or breaking the mount off. And what we found out was that we just needed a more durable solution there. So what we did is we made a hinged fender that can flex out of the way with a plastic, basically, skid plate or bumper underneath. So you wheelie up, you drag on the plastic skid plate that can easily be replaced. The fender kind of stays out of the way. It doesn't really get bent up or have any issues like that. And then you're done with your wheelie. It's actually spring loaded with a thick rubber O-ring and just right back down into place.
Perfect. Again, one of those things, just thinking about kind of durability, but also the longevity, right? It's one thing to like, you always want your bike to look fresh, right? You always want it to look good, and that's just one of those things that's just gonna save your rear fender, and not limit the amount of fun you can have when you're, not in wheelie mode and actually squeeze that trigger too hard.
I think the thing that's unique, right, is if you're on a real motorcycle and you crash that hard, you're replacing the rear fender every time, right? But with RC vehicles, crashes are common, they're regular, they happen. And we didn't want to be replacing fenders every time that happened. So that's why we went with those panels, the molded plastic panels, and then even on that one, gave it the room to have some give and move out of the way rather than be damaged.
All right, so if you're an RC, if you ever walked into a hobby shop, the number one thing we all do is you kind of come up to your car and you kind of always got to check out the suspension, right? So let's talk about this, because we talked about kind of the shock that's in the crush structure, but now let's talk about the rear shock and the front forks. I say maybe we start with the rear shock there.
Yeah, sounds good. I mean, really the important thing for us, right, with a motorcycle is the shock needs to be pretty far forward on the swing arm to get it out of the way of the rear tire. And when you do that, you have a huge motion ratio. So the shock needs to be relatively stiff. But the best way to improve the way that that works is to have a rising rate rear suspension. So what it is it's just a multi-link rear suspension that basically stiffens the feel of the shock as it travels through because it pivots up and it starts to move the shock at a faster rate when it gets higher in the travel. So basically what that does is it makes it feel more plush around ride height, and then as you get those big compressions or those hard landings, it's going to stiffen up towards the bottom so that it doesn't bottom out or doesn't bottom out as hard. We started with basically like an 8 scale shock. And once we got production bikes or production prototype bikes and kind of figured out how heavy the bike was, we were way undersprung and underdampened. Just for reference, like a Truggy front spring is like about 6 pounds, 5.5 to 6 pounds. The rear spring on this bike is 21 pounds, right? So you have one shock holding 80% of the weight of the whole bike that weighs more than a Truggy. So you have a really stiff spring on it and 4 to 5 weight oil, and it makes the shock is ridiculously stiff. Like if you take it out of the bike and you feel it, you're like, no way, this thing is crazy, right? But you put it in the bike with the motion ratio of the suspension and the rising rate, and it actually feels about right for big hits. And that was really the goal for us is if it's not perfect in the low speed stuff, you can still drive it fine, but you don't want to be having any bucking issues off those big jumps.
Right.
Yeah.
No OTB situations for sure. Awesome, so that's the rear. Let's talk about the front. The first thing that comes to mind is volume displacement, right? When you have such a thick shaft going through there, if this whole thing packs with fluid, you push that actual amount of volume in there, the fluid's got nowhere to go, creates issues. So we had to come up with a completely new design that I've personally never seen in RC at all. Talk me through kind of what's going on in here, because it looks good, but why does it perform good?
So the forks were the hardest part of the project, like full stop. We went through a prototype design, a V1 design, a V2, and this is the V3. And it took us, those 3 kind of failures, the 3 ways to not make the light bulb work, to find out how to make the forks work. And not only did they work in terms of durability, not leaking, not having any issues, but they actually performed way better once we got to this final design. So the fork shaft now is actually your shock body. So it's actually fluid filled in here, and you have a long piston shaft that actually mounts to this cap up here, rides through into the top of this fork shaft, and there's a piston. So the lower shaft travels up and it moves the oil through the piston. So now you have an 8mm bore fork shaft, basically shock body inside, and a 3mm shaft that runs from the top through. So that solved all of our leaking issues. We've had great durability with the fork tubes and fork shafts. And really it got us to where the volume displacement was appropriate, acceptable. We could tune the forks, they would perform repeatedly, wouldn't cavitate the oil or have any other issues like that. Another thing that's really cool is that the springs are internal of the fork tube here, but they're external of the actual shock portion of the fork. So the shock is in the fork leg here, and the springs are in the tube between the top of the shock and the top of the shock body. And then there's little ride height spacers that fit between the springs. So if you want to adjust the ride height on your forks, you can stiffen up the springs and do all the kind of tuning that way. And the nice thing is you get tools with the bike to rebuild your forks and your rear shock. You can crack them open, change the oil, tune on the piston, and improve the suspension to fit your needs. But the package out of the box works really well.
Most conditions for sure, but I think what you ended there was key, is that it may sound complicated, but the springs are separate from the shock. So rebuilding this thing is just as easy as any other shock. You don't have springs inside oil you gotta take out and clean up and all this kind of mess. And I think that's what we hit. I think once people actually see these parts and see the way it functions, they're just gonna go, oh, that works, I get it now. But I think, like you said, it took us 3 legit different versions to get there. So I think we're glad. I think it's something that's a revolutionary design that not only makes this thing look good, but again, handle good.
The bike has to work as good as I want it to. Like, I'm not gonna be happy putting this thing out until I'm happy with it myself. And I know that I have like a high bar. I know that Gil has a high bar and Mike has a high bar and the other guys that worked with me on the forks. And really we just weren't clearing the bar that we had for ourselves in version 1, version 2, so we pushed to version 3. Like you said, we'll do a shock build video. People will be able to see how easy it is. Definitely nothing to be intimidated about, super easy to build. And honestly, they look really cool when you take them apart. Yeah.
All right, so we covered the technology, we covered the scale looks, we went into the durability, we talked about so much, but I think as gearheads, we want to talk about the powertrain, right? So we kind of saved the best for last. So talk to me about kind of the power system. What's inside those actual twin aluminum plates?
I mean, the whole time I worked at hobby shops, the first question is how fast does it go, right? So let's get into it. Yeah, so we have a 2S brushless system. It's a Spectra Firma 85 amp ESC housed here in the middle of the chassis. And that's connected to a 540 sized brushless motor, 3800 kV 4-pole. And it provides more than enough power for the motorcycle. I know we touched on the 8.2 pounds, and it's kind of thinking, man, it's 2S and it's 85 amps is, you know, solid, and a 540 size motor. Well, just because of the narrow tires and the high center of gravity, the way that the bike corners and everything, like, you have a ton of power in the bike with that system. It does not feel underpowered at all, ever. You're popping wheelies, you're throwing roost, you're going 40 plus on the street, right? So yeah, 2S, you know, 3S would just be overkill. It'd be really hard to drive. It would be kind of out of control. So you got that 2S brushless power system, and you're laying down some serious power out of the drivetrain.
Perfect. Anybody that's actually written or driven this thing has definitely not complained about power, but it's one thing to have an abundant amount of power, which we have, but we also got to get that power to the ground, right? And I think for that, we have a slipper clutch built into this.
Yeah, absolutely. So similar to like a two-wheel drive buggy, we have a dual disc slipper clutch plate system built into the motorcycle. There's actually on the right side of the bike here, there's a gearbox kind of behind this right boot, and right here in the middle is a compound clutch setup with 2 gears that go from the pinion to the spur to the output shaft. And then there's actually a hole here in the chassis behind the left boot, so you can get your slipper wrench through, and you can adjust the pressure put on that slipper clutch for varying surfaces, amounts of grip or whatever. If you're trying to put down power faster than the bike can accelerate, the clutch gives a little bit, it keeps the front wheel from popping up, you actually accelerate quicker. You're in the air and you're holding wide open throttle to keep the balance right, and the rear tire's at, you know, 10,000 RPM faster than the wheel speed needs to be for the bike hitting the ground. All of that difference in wheel speed has to go somewhere, right? So the clutch absorbs that, takes that in, but it doesn't really reduce the amount of drive that the bike has. So it just kind of takes out the bad stuff and keeps the power going to the ground.
So it sounds like the slipper clutch is not just to help you put the power to the ground, but also protect your drivetrain from kind of harsh impacts when you kind of flat land on a high traction surface. Now, speaking of that slipper clutch, I know the output shaft is right here next to this chain drive, which again, we can't call it a motorcycle if it doesn't have a real chain, right? So let's go into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was like step one, right? If it's gonna be a motorcycle, you gotta have a chain on it. Right. So yeah, we basically spec'd out a chain. It's actually a pretty standard but small size chain. It has 70 rollers, to tell you how long it is. It doesn't have a master link. It's all fully assembled, so you don't have to worry about any master links popping apart or anything. And yeah, the chain wraps around a steel sprocket up front. It's a 10 tooth, and then we have our aluminum sprocket here in the rear. It's aluminum with clear anodizing. And yeah, it just really drives the powertrain really efficiently. We have a tapered cut on that rear pulley, so if any dirt gets in there, it just the rollers kind of knock it into the taper and push the dirt out, just like you would see on a real dirt bike. We even have a chain guide here to keep your fingers out of any kind of danger spots, and to protect the chain when you're out there riding. And yeah, just no durability issues at all. Obviously, there's no belts to break or snap, no gears to kind of grind through. So you get out to that exposed part of the powertrain, you're putting a lot of power down, you have a really big tire, and you just have the most durable way to put that power to the ground in a chain, and it looks the part too.
Awesome. So we talked about the system, putting that power down, 40 plus miles an hour. That's fast. When it comes to stopping, what's both sides doing here?
Yeah, so that was one of the early lessons, right? As a prototype bike, we only had rear tire braking because the brake was basically coming through the ESC to the motor and stopping the rear tire. Well, if you've ever ridden a mountain bike, a dirt bike, road bike, whatever, you know that most of your braking force comes from the front tire, because as soon as you start braking, the weight starts shifting forward and the rear tire doesn't have a lot of weight on it, so it doesn't have a lot of traction. It's not really going to slow you down. So that's when we came up with the front brake system here. We have a steel front rotor that's floating here. We have some brake pads in here, caliper with a piston, and then a cable that's driven by a servo. It provides a lot of braking pressure to the tire that has the weight on it. It reduces your stopping distance by an incredible amount. I mean, we're stopping now from full speed, full speed on street in less than 80 feet. We were over 150 before. So it was, you know, great speeds, but if you don't have any control over it, not as much fun. Now you can really like charge through sections, get on the brake into a berm, kind of get back out going the other way.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely stopping a key part of going fast. So glad we definitely worked that in. Well, I think we kind of covered the kind of grand scheme of things and kind of the work and kind of what makes this Promoto-Mx super special. I want to thank you so much for taking the time, not only the past time for recording this video, but the past 3.5 years of development time between you, Gil Losi Jr., and Mike Mellon, the engineer behind the project, for bringing not only the Losi brand, but everybody behind that lens, an awesome product. I mean, the best way that I can describe this, the first time I used it, is that it made me feel like I was using an RC car for the first time again. It made me feel like it was Christmas Day, 9 years old. Any other kind of last comments that you might have before we exit here?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's you know RC and you know the lefts and rights, but you get to learn how to drive something over again, and it's just the most fun challenge. I've had so many days of leaving the test track and just calling you or Todd or somebody and be like, I had so much fun driving this thing today. And I think everybody knows, like, I'm big into racing, so the fact that you can just have so much fun with this is amazing, and we can't wait for you guys to get to try it. I just want to share that fun with everybody.
Yeah, I think it's going to be revolutionary when guys get these in their hands and they kind of get that same experience that we do. It's hard to describe, but once you feel it, it's hard to put in words. So other than that, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. It's not the only video we have for this. We have quick start guides, in-depth videos, how to upgrade, how to race, how to turn. So feel free to go over to our social media, that's losi.rc on Instagram, give us a follow, or even check out our YouTube on just straight Losi and check out all the great content we have for the Promoto-Mx. Thank you so much, and we'll see you in the next one.